The Boxcar Children, Mystery Ranch by Gertrude Chandler Warner. Chapter 9. The Yellow Stones. Now that the children were together, they were very happy. Aunt Jane seemed to be getting more cheerful every day. One morning Jessie heard her aunt call her. "I want to see all 4 of you children," Aunt Jane told Jessie. "Get the others in here before I'm tired again." In a few minutes the children were sitting in their aunt's room. Watch lay down at Jessie's feet and put his head on his paws. Only his eyes moved. He was very still. "Now I want you to listen carefully," said Aunt Jane, looking at each of them in turn. "What I have to say is very important." Since the children couldn't be more quiet than they already were, they sat and waited for her to go on. "I'm going to give you children this ranch." "No, don't say a word. You are the only relatives I have. You seem to be good children, and you have been kind to me." The children were too surprised to say anything. "I know you are not old enough to manage the ranch alone," she said, "so I'm going to bring Sam Weeks into it. He will manage the ranch for you. Mr. Pond, who handles my business, says that will be all right. Now what have you to say to that?" Henry was the first to speak. "We're too surprised to say much, Aunt Jane. It's wonderful." Watch got up and went over to the bed. He sat down and held out his paw. Aunt Jane took his paw and said, "I see you think this is a good idea. If Watch thinks that, I am sure it must be true." She patted the dog and went on. "The ranch is yours from this minute. All I have to do is write my name when Mr. Pond brings the papers. I want my ranch to belong to people who love it. That's why I couldn't sell it to those 3 men." The 4 children said "Thank you" very softly as they left. "The only thing about this that I don't like is your grandfather," said Benny. He threw himself down on the grass. "You said that wrong, old fellow," said Henry. "But we know what you mean. It leaves grandfather out." "I believe some day Aunt Jane will like him," said Violet, "and he will like her." "I hope so," said Jessie. They sat on the grass and looked at their ranch. The driveway came to the back door. It went past the windmill, past the barn, and then out again to the road. They could see woods and mountains. They could see the long chicken houses from where they were sitting. "Who were the men Aunt Jane was talking about?" said Henry. 3 men came while we were buying groceries," Violet answered. "They tried to make Aunt Jane sell the ranch to them." "She probably needed the money," said Henry, "but I'm glad she gave the ranch to us instead of selling it. I hope she won't be sorry." Benny said thoughtfully, "I think we ought to explore right away. If this is our ranch, we should know everything that's on it." Jessie said, "Well, we could explore today. Let's ask Aunt Jane where to go." The cross little lady was very pleased when the children asked her about their walk. No one had asked her advice for years. "The first thing is, don't get lost. Go down past the chicken houses and you will come to some woods. Go through the woods and you come to an open field. There is a stream. Follow that stream and you'll come right back home." Benny said, "I think we should take a lunch. Don't you, Aunt Jane?" "By all means," said Aunt Jane, trying to hide a smile. It was very hot in the sun, and the children went down past the chicken houses. They came to the cool green woods. "It's a beautiful place," said Henry. "A very nice place to eat lunch too," said Benny. The others laughed, but they were always hungry. They found a place where they could sit down. It was quiet and cool. Jessie was eating the last of her sandwich when she stopped suddenly. "Look, Henry," she whispered. She pointed to some bushes not far away. "There's a little hut." Henry got to his feet quickly. "The door is open," he said. "It seems to be empty." The children went slowly towards the hut. There was nothing in it, but in front of it there was a fireplace made of stones, almost hidden by the bushes. Henry put his hand down and felt the stones. Watch sniffed and wagged his tail. "Well, let's be going," said Henry. "It looks to me as if someone built a fire here, and not too long ago either." The children walked faster now, and soon they came out in the big field with rocks and stones. "There's no grass here," said Benny. "This field isn't very good, I would say." "But it's very pretty," said Violet. "See the yellow and black lines in these rocks?" "These stones are yellow too," said Jessie. She picked up a handful of the stones. As she dropped one, it broke into a fine yellow powder. "They seem to be made of yellow sand," said Henry. "How queer." Chapter 10. When Sam came with the milk next day, he was surprised to see all 4 children on the back steps. They were waiting for him. "Well, well, early birds," he said. "Why did you get up so early?" We wanted to see you, Sam," said Henry. Here I am, but I'm not much to look at," laughed Sam. "Yes, you are, Sam," said Benny. "I think you are a very fine-looking man, and besides, we want to talk to you." "Wait until I feed the chickens, and I'll be glad to sit down and talk." The children went with Sam to the chicken houses and watched him. "We want to know just how you do things," said Jessie, "so please show us." Sam was glad to show them how to feed the chickens, give them water, and get the eggs. In a little while they were all sitting on boxes in a big open door of the barn. Henry spoke up. "Aunt Jane says she's going to give us this ranch." "Give you her ranch?" cried Sam. He could not believe his ears. "You are too young to own a ranch." "Mr. Pond says we aren't if you would be our boss." "Mr. Pond?" asked Sam. "Did he come here?" "No, but he wrote letters to Aunt Jane," said Henry. "He knows about things like that, Aunt Jane says." "He would know, but I still can't believe it." Sam shook his head. "Just the same," he went on, "I'd like to have a chance to fix up this old place. Now, if we had some money, I could start a good egg business for you." Sam stopped and shook his head again. "But I still can't believe it," he said. "You'll just have to believe it, Sam," said Henry. "Aunt Jane said the ranch is ours right now. All she has to do is sign some papers." Sam picked a blade of grass and chewing on it. He was upset at this strange news. "What would we do after we got the egg business started?" asked Jessie. "Well, I'd raise wheat. There are about 500 acres on this ranch that would grow wheat." "How big is this ranch?" asked Henry. "The fields go way over to the mountains. Your aunt owns all that land." "I never thought anything like this would happen when we came to see Aunt Jane," said Jessie. The children and Sam sat looking at the big ranch that would soon be theirs. "There's another surprise," Sam said. "I've seen your mystery man." "Oh, where is he?" "He is still in town, but no one knows why. We never have strangers in Centerville, and everyone wonders why he is there." "Haven't you any police in Centerville?" asked Henry. "I think this man ought to be watched." "Oh, no, Henry," said Jessie quickly. "If you ever saw him, you wouldn't think that." "Well, we never had a policeman here anyway," said Sam. "No need of one. But there is a sheriff in Stony Creek. That's the next town. His name is Bates." "Look what's coming!" cried Benny. "A car." "It's Mr. Pond, sure as I live," said Sam. "I guess this story of yours must be true." "Mr. Pond is certainly early," said Jessie, laughing. "We haven't had breakfast." Watch got to his feet and stood still, looking at the stranger. Then he began to wag his tail a very little. "Good morning, Sam," called Mr. Pond. He came slowly toward the barn. Watch did not bark. He walked slowly towards the strange man, wagging his tail more and more. "Well, hello. What's your name?" Mr. Pond asked the dog. "Are you a good dog?" Benny said, "His name is Watch and he is a very good dog, but he almost always barks at strangers." "Well, see that you don't bark at me, old boy," said Mr. Pond. He patted Watch. Then he looked at the children with a nice surprise. "Your aunt sent for me," he said. "Suppose we go in and get this business done. You come too, Sam. Miss Jane doesn't like to wait when she has made up her mind." Henry said, "Will you wait just a minute, Mr. Pond? We want to talk to you before we see Aunt Jane." Mr. Pond said, "I suppose you are Henry." "Yes, sir, I am. We'd love to have this ranch, but it's all Aunt Jane has, and we don't want to take it away from her. Do you understand?" "That's very fine," said Mr. Pond, nodding. "I can fix that easily. I can add a line saying that the money you get from the ranch will be used to take care of your aunt as long as she lives. Is that what you mean?" "We'll feel better that way," said Jessie. "Of course, we would do it anyway, but it's nice to have it in writing." They walked to the house where Maggie met them at the door. "I'm glad to see you, Mr. Pond," she said. "Jane can't wait a minute when she wants anything. She keeps asking why you haven't come." "It won't take very long," said Mr. Pond with a nice smile for Maggie. "I have all the papers right here with me. I'll just put in another line that Henry wants." As Mr. Pond promised, it did not take long. Aunt Jane wrote her name. The 4 children wrote their names. Sam wrote his, and Mr. Pond was last. In 10 minutes, the ranch was owned by the 4 Alden children. Sam Weeks was the manager. "Isn't it funny," said Benny, "what you can do just by writing your name?" Mr. Pond laughed. I give you children 1,280 acres of land and a big ranch house." "And a hut too," said Benny, "where someone has been staying." "What? What's that?" asked Aunt Jane. "I didn't know there was a hut on my land." "We didn't want to worry you," said Henry, "but we did find a hut in the woods, and it looks as if someone built a fire there." "We didn't see anyone, though," said Jessie. Mr. Pond looked very serious. Then he smiled and said, "I'm sure it's nothing to worry about. Now you eat your breakfast and let me talk to Sam." The 2 men went out and they stood by the car for a long time talking while Jessie got breakfast. She would have been surprised if she had known what they were saying. She would have been excited too, for they were not talking about the ranch, but about the man on the train and the hut in the woods. Jessie fixed a breakfast tray and took it into her aunt's room. This morning Jessie did not ask her aunt to eat. She just put the tray down in front of the little woman. Miss Alden ate bacon and toast and an egg without saying a cross word. "Aunt Jane," said Jessie, "you'll never be sorry that you gave us your ranch. We love it. We will take care of it. We love you too, and we will always take care of you even after we go home." Aunt Jane sighed. No one had ever wanted to take care of her before. She looked very happy. "I feel safe now," she said. "I know that my ranch will be taken care of by people who love it." Chapter 11. A Strange Offer. That night Henry did not sleep very well. He kept thinking of the men who had tried to buy Aunt Jane's ranch. He decided to talk to Jessie alone. But as it was not easy for the older children to get away from Benny, he wanted to do first one thing and then another. Finally he wanted to go to the barn and see the horse. "It's our horse after all," said Benny. "We ought to get acquainted with our own horse." Watch began to bark when Violet led him out the back door. "Bark all you want to, Watchy," shouted Ben. Benny, nobody can hear you, and I'll yell too." After a few good yells, Benny started towards the barn. All the children followed. Watch ran around the old barn looking for mice. The black horse stood looking at them all. "What's our horse's name?" asked Benny. "Maggie says he hasn't any name," Jessie said. "She just says, 'Go on, old boy.'" "Old boy isn't a good name," said Benny. "Let's call him Snowball." Everyone laughed. The thin old horse was black all over, but from then on, old boy was called Snowball. "Come on, Watch," said Benny at last. "Let's go upstairs where the hay is. Maybe you'll find a rat." Violet followed Benny, and this gave Henry his chance. He winked at Jess, who followed him outside at once. "Look, Jessie," whispered Henry, "I don't like the idea of strange men bothering Aunt Jane." "Neither do I," said Jessie softly. "The men told her the ranch was no good, just a few chickens and an old horse." "That's it," cried Henry. "If the ranch is no good, why do they want to buy it? I think I ought to do something about this." "Tell Sam," advised Jessie. "I'll do better than that," said Henry at last. "I'll tell Sam to tell Mr. Pond, and Mr. Pond seems to know everything." After they had told their troubles to Sam, the older children felt better. They were pleased when they saw Sam start for Mr. Pond's house. In a very short time, Mr. Pond's car came up the driveway. Sam was with him. They were both very serious. "Sam and I want to see that hut in the woods," Mr. Pond said. "Will you take us there?" "Sure," said Henry. "We know exactly where it is." "Let's all go," cried Benny. Jessie went to the front hall and told Maggie where they were going. "Don't tell Aunt Jane that we are going back to that hut. It would worry her. Just say we went for a walk. We'll be back in time for dinner." Jessie saw the others halfway to the chicken house. She hurried to catch up with them. They walked faster this time because they knew just where they were going. They came to the hut. "Be quiet now," whispered Sam. "We want to see if anyone is there. Anyone is here." The children sat down in the woods. "Is there anything different about the hut?" whispered Mr. Pond. "Yes," whispered Henry. "There is some wood in the fireplace. It wasn't there the other time." They sat very still for a long time. They heard nothing. They saw nothing new. "Well," said Mr. Pond at last, "we might sit here all day for nothing. Let's take a closer look at the hut." They walked over to the hut. Sam put his hand on the stones of the fireplace. "Warm," he said. They all felt the stones. They were very warm. The fire had not been out very long. "Well, someone surely stays here," said Mr. Pond. He seemed worried. "Do you suppose it's your mystery man?" asked Benny. "Goodness, no," Jessie answered. He's much too nice to live in a hut on someone else's land." They walked out of the woods and into the field full of rocks. "Aren't these rocks funny?" said Violet. "I never saw such yellow rocks. And look at the black lines across them." "Like a tiger," said Benny. Henry looked again at the rocks. He seemed to be deep in thought. "Now what is it they make me think of?" he said to himself. Yellow with black lines. I have seen something about that somewhere." "Do you know the name of these yellow stones, Mr. Pond?" asked Violet. She picked up one and gave it to him. "No, I don't know much about stones," he said. "This yellowish rock makes a fine powder. I know that Indians long ago used it for their sand paintings." "Sand paintings," said Benny. "I've never heard of sand paintings." "They are very interesting," said Mr. Pond. "They are beautiful too. The Indians took sand of all colours, blue, green, red, yellow, black, brown. They looked for a nice flat place and painted it with coloured sand. They put the different colours in the right places, and they would make a round sun like this." Mr. Pond quickly made a big yellow sun on the ground to show Benny how it was done. "Do you think there are any sand paintings in our field now?" "No," answered Mr. Pond, smiling. "There haven't been any Indians here for many years." "I'd rather have Indians here than whoever is living in that hut," said Jessie. "I think you're right," said Mr. Pond. "But don't worry about that. We'll go to Stony Creek tomorrow and tell the sheriff, Mr. Bates, about this." He glanced at Henry, and the boy understood that Mr. Pond would tell the sheriff about some other things too. Chapter 12. The Mystery Man. Early the next morning the 4 Olden children climbed into Mr. Pond's car. He had come to take them to Stony Creek. They were going to see the sheriff, Mr. Bates. Mr. Pond was very quiet. He was worried about these nice children. He liked them even though he had only known them a short time. And he was worried about Jane Alden too. He had known her for many years. He knew well enough that she had always been cross and hard to get along with. But he was very sorry for her. He didn't want any of them to be upset by these 3 strange men. They drove up in front of the courthouse on Stony Creek, and Mr. Pond stopped the car. "Come right in," called Mr. Bates. "I'm glad you came. I don't often have so much company." "Hello, Bates," said Mr. Pond. "These are the Alden children." "I had already guessed that," said Mr. Bates. He took his guest to a small back room and shut the door. They all sat down. "Well, what brings you here?" asked Mr. Bates. Mr. Pond said, "We came to see you about police business. There is something going on in the Alden woods. It looks as if someone has been living in an old hut there." Mr. Bates didn't look surprised. He just waited for Mr. Pond to go on. "That isn't all," Mr. Pond said. 3 strange men tried to make Miss Jane Alden sell her ranch. They told her it was no good. Say, Bates, you act as if you know something that I don't. What do you really think about all this?" Mr. Bates just sat and smiled. "Maybe you won't have to worry about those men any longer," he said, "and I don't think anyone will be staying in that hut either. But I'll wait and let Mr. Carter tell you all about it." "Mr. Carter? Who would that be?" asked Benny. "He is a very important man," Mr. Bates said, still smiling. "Here he comes now." The car stopped just behind Mr. Pond's. A good-looking young man got out. He was very tall. He had soft brown hair, and when he stood in the door, Jessie and Violet looked at him with their mouths open. Then they looked at one another. Jessie could hardly talk. "Oh, Violet," she whispered, "our mystery man." "Are you surprised?" asked Mr. Carter laughingly. "We certainly are," said Benny. "We thought you might be a bad man. Well, that is, Henry thought so anyway." "Benny," Henry said, blushing, "I didn't really think that. Mr. Carter, I just thought the police should, well, you were a stranger and—" "That's all right, Henry," said the mystery man, smiling again. "That was a smart thing to think." "But if you're not a bad man, who are you?" asked Benny. "Well, I've been working for you, but you didn't know it." "Working for us?" asked Benny. "You don't look like a ranch hand." "There are many ways to work," Mr. Carter said, "and one of them is looking for uranium." "Uranium!" Jessie cried. She had finally found her voice again. "Yes," said Mr. Carter, "my job is to look for uranium, and I found a field of it right on your ranch." "Do you mean that all that Indian dust is really uranium?" "It certainly is," Mr. Carter answered, looking at all the surprised faces around him. "But why were you looking there?" asked Violet. "And who are those 3 tough men?" Mr. Carter answered slowly. "I work for a man you may have heard of, Mr. Alden of Greenfield." "Grandfather!" the children cried. "Yes, Mr. Alden hired me to look for uranium for him. There is a lot of it in this part of the country, but when I found it on your ranch, I also found that someone had been there first." "That must be those 3 men," Henry said. Yes, they were looking for uranium too, but they were not honest. When they found a place that had uranium, they tried to buy the land cheap. They didn't tell people what they had found. That's just what they tried to do to us, Violet said. Yes, Mr. Carter went on, but Mr. Bates and I caught up with them. You won't be bothered by them again. Are they the ones who stayed in that hut on our ranch? Yes, but I had an eye on them. They couldn't have hurt you, Mr. Carter said. Henry spoke slowly. This means that the ranch is worth a lot of money, doesn't it? It certainly does, said Mr. Carter. Wait till I tell Aunt Jane, shouted Benny. Can we tell people? Asked Henry. I suppose so, said Mr. Carter. It is no longer a secret. I'm afraid your ranch will not be quite much longer. Your place will soon be full of strangers. Maybe some of them will try to take rocks away from your uranium fields. He looked worried for the first time since he had come in the door. What can we do? Asked Jessie. It would be terrible to upset Aunt Jane just when she is getting better. Can you help them, Mr. Pond? Asked Mr. Carter. No, I'm afraid not, said Mr. Pond. It is too big a job for me. I think the children need a smarter man than I am, and they need someone with enough money to dig a mine. Henry said, I think I know the very man. And the four children shouted together, Grandfather!